Today, we're going to talk about the unbelievably good soundtrack for a game called Trax. Bizarrely, this game was fully released for Super Nintendo, but the separately developed Sega Genesis version never was. This is bizarre because that version was actually pretty good. You can play it online right now and try it if you'd like. Although it may have taken a little longer to develop than its Super Nintendo counterpart, the Genesis version of this game has a beginning and an end, and an epic soundtrack, well loved by today's chip music community. So, this isn't even a cancellation we're talking about, this is just straight up left unreleased, even while it was already seeing decent reviews in widely circulated gaming magazines at the time. The show it was based on still was on the air up until December 1994, and it still appears to have been decently reviewed until the end. And it's worth noting that from what I can find online, it wasn't exactly in a ratings tailspin, so I'm guessing this didn't really have anything to do with the cancellation. So why on earth would a game company spend all this money producing and then not releasing Trax? Well, it's doubtful we'll ever know for sure, but if you follow the trail of public information, it seems as though Marvel has quite a bit to do with this. So in order to further explore why this may have happened, we're going to briefly talk about comic books. In 1994, Marvel and DC weren't quite the same companies they are today. The comic book industry as a whole during this period was somewhat of a bursting bubble. For years, sales numbers for comics had been artificially pumped up by collectors and speculators who saw these as literal investments, expecting even the most random, obscure special issues to have a high chance of becoming valuable someday. Unfortunately, not every single superhero was destined to pull in Batman-level numbers, and so once the market began realizing this, stores were just kind of left with piles of first edition comics that just weren't going to sell anymore. Unfortunately for fans of the 90s sci-fi TV show Trax, who also owned Sega systems, the people making your game were a company called Malibu Interactive, and at the time they were owned by a company called Malibu Comics. Malibu, like much of the comics industry, was getting hit hard, and making matters worse was that their venture into video games seems to have been a gamble taken at pretty much the worst time. Interactive just never quite became as profitable as their comic division. According to numerous reports, comments, and message board posts I could find from people associated with 90s Malibu around April 1994, DC Comics actually approached the company about buying them. This spurred months of productive negotiations. While this was going on, Trax's development seems to have been going well. It was already being shown around and given decent reviews by magazines like GamePro, etc. Yet, despite it seeming inevitable that DC was about to save Malibu, their arch-rival would somehow manage to swoop in at the 11th hour. According to Tom Mason, one of the original founders of Malibu, Marvel somehow caught wind of their rival closing in on this deal, and hastily cobbled together their own non-negotiable counteroffer, complete with a 7-day deadline to accept it. Apparently, this was an incredible offer, and so Marvel ended up acquiring Malibu, and completely threw a wrench into months of work over at DC. And despite all the IP and studio technology that they would receive from the buyout, here are some comments I found from industry insiders who apparently believe this deal was mostly done because Marvel simply feared that DC would just become too powerful by acquiring Malibu. By November 1994, Marvel ended up completing their purchase, and they pretty much immediately gutted Malibu Interactive from the larger company and sold it off. And I'm guessing this is where any chance of Trax releasing was vaporized. Whoever would end up with the game hadn't sunk any cost into it, and I'm guessing they just didn't see too much use in spending anything to truly complete it. Black Pearl Software, a subsidiary of THQ, as the company which was set to publish it. But bizarrely, there's also a company called Malibu Games, which seems to have worked for THQ, and may have even collaborated on the Super Nintendo version of Trax. I also kind of need to doubt how accurate these magazines were because some of them seem to have reviewed the Super Nintendo version and erroneously labeled it as Sega, so we may have reached sort of an impasse with publicly available information. Perhaps the cash-bleeding Malibu had been hoping, maybe even planning, that Marvel would just come in and complete Trax development, or DC at some point. Looking at all of this together, my best guess is that Trax for Sega would have released if Malibu Interactive had continued existing in its original form. Unfortunately, it seems to have been cast aside like an extra in an Avengers movie, while DC and Marvel duked it out for the future of comic entertainment. With all that context being established, let's check out the tracks. For this game, Tim Follin actually used a unique sound driver built by longtime coworker Dean Belfield, which would end up only ever being utilized for time tracks. From what few public comments I could find about it, neither Tim nor Dean have access to it anymore. Throughout time tracks, Follin harnessed this sound chip and driver to powerfully emulate acoustic instruments, as well as experiment with the pure synth capabilities offered by FM synthesis, giving this whole soundtrack a vibe sort of caught between analog and digital. An example of this combo is the organ solo from the Mission Briefing tune. Not only did Tim do an amazing job emulating a live organ solo, but he also worked a fair amount of synth-style bending, which you wouldn't be doing on an analog Hammond. I would say most people are used to analog instruments behaving like analog and digital instruments behaving digitally, so to strike this balance where elements from both can be used effectively does take some care. Another tone I want to point out within the track is the absolutely gnarly keys patch, which sounds like it contains analog-style artifacts. I would also like to call attention to this 5/4 tune featuring tons of percussion and FM bell tones. These tones give me the impression of found percussion, almost like the FM equivalent of hitting empty soda bottles with sticks, and it kind of evokes a sort of street chase vibe to me. And Follin eventually introduces this massive bell tone, which performs a 4-beat polyrhythmic phrase for a few bars. So Glitchy got pretty excited about these tones, so our bot friend is going to walk us through some of the more guitaristic moments in the soundtrack. Simply judging by the fact that it only has 5 or so tracks, you'd think this soundtrack is light on material. But these are lengthy tunes with constantly evolving landscapes. A hallmark of Follin's is making incredibly long song forms for parts of the game which might only require a few seconds of interaction. The Mission Briefing is a classic example of this. You technically could skip right through these screens and enjoy the gameplay of time tracks just the same. Also notable is Tim's use of fade-outs, which sound impeccably detailed for something coming from a sound chip. My understanding is that he would manually enter velocity values in by hand to achieve this. Welcome to a special edition Nasty Licks video nested inside the Time Tracks video. As has been made abundantly clear over the years by myself and the Jazzbots, Tim is no stranger to the nasty lick, which I define as a short and nasty melody, which is more soloistic in nature, even if it's composed in advance. I had Pitchy choose some examples. And a note on the tempo. So if you've ever come across this music online before and are wondering why it's been uploaded at different speeds, that is related to the fact that it was planned for release in PAL and NTSC markets. Tim directly addresses this in a YouTube comment made from the official channel of his game company, Baggy Cat. According to him, an ideal tempo for the soundtrack might be somewhere in between. I guess he sort of averaged the experience out between the two markets. Okay, so I've shown you bits and pieces from the 3 main level themes, the cutscenes, and the intro theme. But there is one more super juicy song from the soundtrack that I must share with you. Featuring thick major 7 and minor 9 voicings and a hip-hop style lead synth playing arpeggios, this totally evokes the type of stuff which was being written in American pop music at the time. I can only imagine what type of nastiness Tim could have come up with had he spent more time with FM synthesizers. His ability to transform absolutely any piece of hardware into a fully functioning band shines in the soundtrack for Time Trax, and I hope that someday he's able to revisit these tones for more. For now, however, we can just be thankful the soundtrack found its way washed up ashore of the internet and enjoy the polyrhythmic synth bells for what they are. Take care and have a dope week.